a resume, so I am going to just read it because I don't want to forget anything. He is the Executive Director of the Samaritan Counseling, Guidance, and Consulting, where he's also the Director of its Caring for Clergy and Congregations program. He's a spiritual director, a clergy coach for pastors, consults with churches, and offers groups and workshops on church, health, and growth, which is something I think we might be interested in. For 22 years, he was senior pastor of Calvin Presbyterian Church in Zelienople, a church that was studied by researchers for its innovative approaches to creating a spiritually grounded church. He is the author of numerous articles and 10 books on spirituality and congregational transformation, including his most recent, Preaching to Those Walking Away. He has a PhD and an MA in Formative Spirituality from Duquesne, a Master's of Social Work from the University of Pittsburgh, and Master's of Divinity from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, where he has also been an adjunct professor. He also has experience as an individual, marital, family, and group therapist in the psychiatric, pastoral counseling, and drug and alcohol settings. Finally, most important, as he said, he is the husband of Diane and the father of twin girls, Erin and Shay. So will you help me and welcome Reverend Standish?
Thank you. I'm actually really glad to be here. You all wouldn't know this, but this church actually has quite a special place in my heart. I have a history here, and it's actually been good. It's not like when I was getting my PhD at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, Alan Foster was the pastor here, and Alan had me come down 3 times, I think, to do classes on Sunday mornings. I think when we did that, we were back in the unrenovated, the classroom at the bottom. So I feel like I must have done better because I've been elevated to the 3rd floor, because when I used to come here, it was in the basement. But I taught, I think, 3 classes on prayer, spirituality, and things like that while working on my PhD. I also twice taught in the Tuesday evening programs. I don't know whether you still have that or not, but you used to have a Tuesday evening educational program. And the other thing that to me makes this a special place, when I was interviewing for churches, I had been an associate pastor at a church in Murraysville for 4 years, and then left to finish my PhD because they're not really set up to. It's hard to work and do a PhD at the same time. I was interviewing with churches, and most times churches want to go, here, you preach somewhere, but I wasn't preaching anywhere, I was teaching in places. And so the search committee from Calvin Presbyterian Church up in Murraysville, it was a night, it was a dark and stormy night. Honestly, rain was coming down in sheets, and it came down literally for like 5, 6, 7 hours, and we had flooding all through Pittsburgh, etc. But the search committee came all the way down from Zelienople, to come watch my class, and as everybody left, they just decided they were going to do their first interview with me right there. So they just grabbed a bunch of chairs in your fellowship hall and made a circle and did about an hour interview with me, and then I ended up going to that church. That would have been, I think that would have been in September, and I think I ended up going to the church in January. So there's been a lot of stuff that I have been able to do in this church, and it's had a significant impact on teaching me how to teach, because I was teaching in the area of spirituality. This would have been 1995. Well, it would have been between 1993 and 1995, and so really had a lot of interaction. I also preached at one of your contemporary services when Tracy Keenan was here as the associate, and so I was down in the what's the fellowship hall now, the service that was just done. So I've had a lot of this church has had some really good influence on me. So I am really excited to be back here to teach you. And I'm really excited to come back and teach you about a topic that has been foundational to my whole ministry. And yet it's also a topic that I think, I don't want to say this. It accounts for why the Presbyterian Church and mainline churches are shrinking. When I went to Calvin Presbyterian Church, it had been a church that was in 30 years of decline. It had about 190 members. They had $18,000 in the bank, period. No endowment. There was one $5,000 savings that was to go to the youth program. At some point, somebody had given it to them something like 5 or 6 years before, and they had never used that money. The church was literally falling apart. It just was, when I say it was crumbling, I actually, when I did my interview, when I actually visited the church for the first time, I started crying on the way home because I really, really liked the people. I really, really liked Zealand and Opal. But the church itself, they hadn't taken care of it in 20 years. It was filthy. The one thing that did save them was, in my looking around, they took me into the church lounge, which is also where they also had their session meetings in. And I don't know how many of you remember, when I say this term, if you remember what this is, but can you picture in your mind red flocking wallpaper? So, what's that?
I said it doesn't say church.
Yeah, well, it also doesn't say, it didn't even say 1990s, let alone now. And we were interviewing, and this had red velvet, red flocking wallpaper with a beige background. And the corner was turned like this. I will say, because I was shocked when I looked at it, and one of the PMC members, Kay River, said, "And Graham, if you come here, you can help us do this." And she grabbed the corner and pulled down half a sheet. And I was like, okay, if they've got that attitude, then we can. Over the course of my time there, we grew to about between 500 and 550 members. We went from being a church that was mostly older to a church of all ages. We had no youth program and very little in education. Grew to having about 100 kids in education and a youth program that regularly got between 50 and 80 kids on a Sunday. By the time I left, we had done about $2.5 million of expansions and renovations and buying property, and we had an endowment of about $350,000, and the church is still doing very well now. So what is it that made a difference? It was the fact that we were a church that was intentional about being open spiritually. It was intentional about trying to help people experience God. And that was a fundamental question we asked in almost everything we did. When people come to worship, are they doing it out of obligation? When they come, are they experiencing God, or are they just experiencing comfort? In our classes, are we teaching people how to hear what God's calling them to do? Are we teaching them how to experience God, or are we teaching them something else? We did an awful lot just on opening spiritual opportunities. In 1998, we built a labyrinth outside the church, which still is there. Anybody can go and walk it. We began to create more small groups around the area of spirituality and spiritual growth. We began to offer more opportunities for prayer. It's still increased since I've left. David, Paul, my successor, has started a Taizé service on Wednesday evenings. They decorated just an incredibly beautiful way. But our experience was, when you open people up spiritually, churches thrive. We look at non-denominational churches and Pentecostal churches, and we focus on the surface, which is often on the surface of things. They do contemporary, they raise their hands, they do stuff. But foundationally at the core, they're helping people experience God. Their sermons are about how you can experience God. Their teachings are about how you can discover the Spirit in your life and open up to God. But that's something that foundationally we Presbyterians aren't comfortable with. The Association of Statisticians of American Religious Behavior every 10 years does a study of churches, of denominations and their fare. They did theirs, they always do it in time with the census, so they did one in 2012, 2022. And what they found was that the Episcopal Church had shrunk 19% in those 10 years. The Methodist and Lutheran churches had shrunk 25% in those 10 years. If you want to take a guess at how much they said Presbyterians have shrunk?
40%.
What would you say?
40.
My gosh, you all should just get gold stars and put it on his forehead. You hit that number right on. We've declined 40%. Meanwhile, non-denominational churches have grown by 72%. Foundationally, it's not about contemporary. It's not about whether they have rock bands or anything. It's about the expectation that you will experience God as part of it. So, that's why what I want to do here over the next 6 weeks, with breaks in between so you guys can get a big break from me, is what do we do with spiritual experiences and mystical encounters? Because it's something that Presbyterians are uncomfortable with. So let me start by taking a look at something that's foundational to Christianity. We read in Acts 2, when the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place, and suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues, as a fire, appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now, there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem, and at this sound, the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear each of us in our own language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Phrygia and Asia, and Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya beyond Cyrene." I should get a gold star just for being a sinner. "And the visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs, in our own languages we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power." All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others sneered and said, "They're filled with new wine." If a group of people in this church did that, how would they be treated? What would you think of them? If somebody you know had this kind of spiritual experience, what would your perspective be? And yet, this is the event that started the Christian church movement. I'll say that again. This is the experience that started the Christian church movement. It was not some great theological revelation. It was not they got together and after much prayer put together a session and decided after that to procure money to get property to start the church. It started with spiritual experiences. Acts is full of spiritual experiences. We read them all, but what Christians have done over time is they've come up with ways to push spiritual experiences to the side. Well, so some will say, well, that stuff only happened back in biblical times. Not according to the Bible. There's nowhere in the Bible that says these kinds of things only happen in biblical times. Or they go, oh, well, this is just sort of some kind of psychological thing that was going on, and maybe it was just misinterpreted. I call that there's kind of an elitism to that, where the assumption is, well, these people were ignorant and stupid, not really smart like we are today. But I would simply say, they had an experience that was transforming not only for them, but transforming for all others. It says in the passages as follows, they baptized 3,000 people that day. So the question is, what do we do with things like this? How do we go about explaining the Pentecost experience? What about other experiences? What do we do with Jesus changing water into wine? A tremendous number of biblical scholars will just say, well, that's just a made-up story because it only shows up in John's gospel. Because biblical scholarship, in a lot of ways, is trying to take kind of a more rational, empirical, scientific approach to the Bible. And many of them subscribe to an idea of if it happened in all four Gospels, it probably did happen, unless it was something that doesn't make rational sense. Then it probably didn't happen. If it showed up in three, maybe it happened, probably did happen, but maybe in a different way. Shows up in only two, really probably didn't happen. They were just trying to make a theological point. And if it showed up in one, it really didn't happen. But we don't actually know that. But the reason why often scholars think that is because they're uncomfortable with spiritual experiences. What about Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead? Or Jesus' healings? Or Jesus' feeding of the 5,000 or 4,000? Or the disciples going out and healing people? Or the 70 who were then sent out and healing people? What do we do with Jesus' resurrection? I have no clue whether these things happen the way it's described or not. But I do know that we're not comfortable with these things, so we have a tendency to put them aside. And so we tend to explain away tangible spiritual experiences with rational sounding explanations. Let me ask you a question. When we explain a spiritual experience with a rational explanation, what are we really, really trying to do? When we try to explain any of these things with a rational explanation, what is it we're really trying to do?
Explain it away.
And make ourselves comfortable. Because we're nervous about these things.
Have it make sense.
What?
Have it make sense in our mind.
Well, and the other thing too is, I mean, I gotta be honest, when you have spiritual experiences, especially really tangible ones, they're kind of scary. Because they don't fit the way we think. They don't fit the way we think of life going. And so what happens is we find ways to explain them away or dismiss them or to psychologize them or something else. I mean, I always think this about Jesus and the disciples healing. I've heard this explanation a lot, which is, well, they probably just had psychosomatic illnesses, something that was in their head that was manifested. And Jesus, by the way he was, managed to heal their psychosomatic issues. Okay, so I'll go along with that, except there's one issue. I run a counseling center. If you can get me somebody who in 5 minutes can actually cure people of all sorts of mental health issues, man, we would never have to ask for money again. We'd be flush with people coming because we could fit, my math isn't right, you've got to take about a 10-minute break, so we could fit basically 10 people in an hour per session instead of doing an hour with one person. Could you imagine how successful a counseling center would be if they could do that? Actually healing something that's psychosomatic is much more difficult than healing something that is physical. Because you can't get, typically medicine, even psychiatric medicines don't work that fast. So why do we struggle so much with spiritual experiences? And that's a question for you. Why do we struggle so much with spiritual experiences in the church? Yeah.
My experience is we live in a secular culture today. Not true when I grew up. But today it's very secular, and so the people we deal with in a secular way.
Yeah. And along with that, we've sort of adopted what I would call secular theology based on empiricism, which is the idea, it's kind of a scientific approach. Unless you can prove it was true, it didn't happen. We bring a kind of skepticism in that basically says, unless it can be proven to be true, it didn't happen. Although that's not really scientific. A scientist would say, well, unless it's proven to be true, basically it means I don't know whether it's real or not. They may bring skepticism into the way they do their research. But for example, I think about atheists who try to basically say God doesn't exist. Well, atheism is not a scientific approach. Agnosticism might be. You know, I don't know whether God exists or not. I mean, until it's proven one way or the other, I don't know. But you'll get a lot of atheists who are scientists who will say, well, you know, because you can't prove God exists, God must not exist. That's not a scientific approach. Does that make sense what I'm saying? I mean, science basically, if you can't prove it, it's agnostic about it. It doesn't hold an opinion. And even when science does try to prove something, generally, if you notice, almost every scientific study has a probability that it is true. Science never actually says this is true. It gives you a probability that it is true. That it exceeds, you know, the variance of you know, I'm forgetting the language right now. But why else do we struggle with spirituality? Yeah.
Doesn't a spiritual experience have to come from within?
Not necessarily. What you're asking, doesn't the spiritual experience have to come from within?
Then I guess I'm not understanding in this concept what spiritual experience is.
Right, and we'll move into that. That's why we're doing 4 weeks.
Because if you're not open to it, you won't feel it.
Yes.
You won't know it's there.
Right.
So you have to explain it away.
Right.
And if you are open to it and you feel it, you can't explain it.
Yes. I misunderstood what you were saying.
Yeah.
I thought you meant the generation
No.
of all spiritual experience. There has to be a receptivity within to it. Yes,
You
I
have
would
to
agree
be
with that.
open to God
Yeah.
to get it.
Absolutely.
And if you're not open, so you probably have not had it, and therefore it doesn't
Right.
exist for you.
Yeah, and that's true of everything. Your perspective matters. If you have a perspective that's open to God and open to spiritual experiences, you're more likely to have them. If you're not, you won't. I'm going to tell a story about that in a little bit, an example of that. Any other thoughts?
I think you probably don't.
Oh, go ahead.
I think you probably don't want to talk about it.
No, we'll get into that in a little bit. What were you going to say?
I think people are really accustomed to thinking in their heads and
Yes.
understanding life in their heads.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to get into your heart and see what's happening in your heart and how you experience and feel what's in your heart.
Yeah, especially for Presbyterians. I mean, we're a denomination that's a very heady intellectual, theological tradition. And I will say, I will add this. Our embrace of theology is also an issue. Because we tend to approach everything theologically. And it's especially true in the Presbyterian denomination. I mean, think about this. All of our seminaries, they all have one word in common in every seminary. Doug, where'd you go to school?
Union.
Union what?
Theological. I went Union Theological Seminary. Now it's Union Presbyterian Seminary.
Okay. What were you going to say?
Theological.
Theological. Yeah, but all of our seminaries have theological, that's their core. And so when things don't fit with the theological, what do you do? So I want to share an experience. So one of the things we did at Calvin Church, and it was a lot of fun and fascinating, is twice in the lead up to Lent, we asked members of our churches to write about their spiritual experiences. And we collected them and we put them into a Lenten devotional that wasn't really written like a devotional, it was just stories of people's experiences of God, which we call Calvin stories. The first time we did it, I think, was sometime around 2001, something like that. We collected a number of stories. At that point, we were about a 350 member church. And I think we printed up and handed out over 500 copies of these stories. Then again, we did it again in around 2011, 2012. And at that point, we were about a 400-something member church. And we ended up printing up and handing out over 800 copies. Because people kept grabbing them from the tables and giving them to all their friends and their family. But one of them, the second one, and I'm going to use his name because he's given me permission to share it. One of our members is a guy named Bill Frank, who's also a friend. Bill was extremely involved in the church and our expansion. But Bill wrote about a story of something that happened to him when, I think, maybe about 4 or 5 years before. His two sons, Wendell and Garrett, and he wanted to go find an old swimming hole that Bill's father used to take him to on Slippery Rock Creek in McConnell's Mill. And if you've ever been to McConnell's Mill, you know that water moves very fast. But apparently there was some place on the creek that was a hole. And so they went looking for it, and they couldn't find it, so they went upstream and found another spot that looked like it would be a good spot to go swimming. And so they wanted to test it out, but before Bill and his friend who was with him could say anything, both of Bill's sons jumped into the water. And they dove in. And as soon as they dove in, Bill could tell neither one of them, there was an undertow in this that was pulling them down. And Bill jumped in, and his friends stayed on the shore. Bill jumped in, trying to get, and he got, Garrett was a little bit smaller, and he got Garrett over to the shore, but he was exhausted in doing this, and he looked at Wendell, and Wendell was going under. And Bill said all he could think of was, oh my God, how do I go home and tell Karen that this happened? And Bill said in that moment, he's trying his best to swim over to Wendell, but because of the way the turbulence was, he could not get there, and he began to pray. And he said, as he was praying, he looked at Garrett, and Garrett came up out of the water and went to the shore and was going towards the shore against the current. And Bill said, Graham, it's honest to God, I can't explain it, but he said the water was running off Wendell's back like in the shape of a handprint. And it said Wendell actually literally came up out of the water and was thrust onto the beach. And obviously a transforming experience for Bill, especially since he didn't have to tell Karen when it happened for a year afterwards. What do you do with a story like that? Yeah.
What do you do with the story, the fact that that didn't happen for somebody else? That's my
I mean, what do you do with the fact that you live in Mount Lebanon and somebody lives in East Liberty?
Yeah, I know, it's just, it's a...
But that's a question that's one of those kinds of questions we ask to dismiss spiritual experiences.
Okay.
But that's because we have a perspective. I'll get into this later. I'll just say it really quickly. We have a perspective of God that somehow if God does that for Wendell but not for someone else, God is fundamentally unfair. But that doesn't take away the experience. The problem is what we do is we dismiss it because we have a perspective on life that we have constructed. This is the way life should go, and we want everything to fit that narrative. But what do we do with things that don't fit that narrative? Do we change the narrative, or do we dismiss the story that doesn't fit? By the way, we live in a country right now where there are narratives that go on, and people dismiss anything that pokes a hole in it completely. It's just we're a narrative-driven culture right now. And so I would simply say, and we're going to get into this, and I think especially in week 3, I'm really going to move into this. It assumes that God operates under the rules that we operate here in this world. Does that make sense? Yeah. So let me keep going. I want to tell a story about Jeff Roy. Jeff Roy, you can see him seated right here. He has a church up in the Muskoka region of Canada. Anybody here been up in the Muskoka region? It's a lake region about 2 hours north of Toronto. And this is called the Three Crosses Church. Jeff used to be a businessman, and Jeff, there was basically, he has an interesting story of how he got to be this way. When he was in his 20s, he was working in business, and he made a lot of money. He just made a lot of money doing business. But he got to a point where he was just dissatisfied with his life, where he really felt like, I'm not living life the way I should be, but I don't know what to do. And he said at that time, he was pretty much an agnostic leaning towards atheism. And he got it into his mind that if he just saved up his money enough, he could eventually just quit his job and build a cabin up somewhere in the mountains of Colorado and live a much better life. And so Jeff did that, and eventually he was able to quit his job, and he decided to drive to Colorado, but he decided first he was going to drive down to West Virginia to get together with a friend and then drive from there over to Colorado. And Jeff said as he left wherever he was in West Virginia, he was driving along, I think it's Route 50 that goes between Clarksburg and Parkersburg. Anybody know if I'm right about that or not?
Yeah.
What's that?
Yeah.
Yeah, Route 50. So he said as he's doing it, he's just really struggling. And he's struggling with the whole idea of, what about faith? What do I do with the idea of God? And he said he just started thinking to himself, well, I really can't believe any of this stuff unless unless Jesus makes himself apparent. And he says, as he's coming over a hill, he sees a sign that says, Jesus is right here, or something along those lines. Jesus is right here. And he's going, well, Jesus, if you're right here, you need to show me. And so he comes over the crest, and as he's driving down, he looks on the other side of the road, and there's this guy with a beard dragging across behind him. And he slows down and yells across, and he goes, "Are you Jesus?" And the guy goes, "No, I'm John." And so Jeff decided to go down and turn around and come back, and he talked to the guy, and the guy basically said he's from St. Joseph, Missouri, and he is dragging across the country to Washington, D.C. to teach people they need to open up to Jesus. And they began to sit and talk, and the guy talked to him about faith. And Jeff said, well, I'm going to Colorado to build a cabin to, find some kind of peace. And he goes, if you're going to do that, you need to stop by St. Joseph, Missouri, and you need to talk to my pastor at this church. You really need to do that. And so Jeff was like, okay, that's fine, I'll do that. So as he's driving along, at one point he picked up a hitchhiker, a young kid, and he said what was weird is the young kid was asking the same kind of struggling questions that Jeff was asking, but Jeff ended up saying all the answers that John had said to him. And eventually they got to St. Joseph, Missouri, and he let the kid go. And he said he went into the church on a Sunday morning, and he said he kind of liked the church, but he was a little bit nervous about going up and talking to the pastor. And so instead he decided that he was going to just grab some cassettes of the pastor's sermon and just keep on driving to Colorado. So he got in his car, he went and got some lunch, some coffee, he puts it in there, and as he's listening to the sermon that this pastor had done, the pastor says, and if some of you are thinking that life might be better if you just go to the mountains of Colorado and build a home, you're searching for God in the wrong place. God can be here right now. And he's like, oh my God, I can't believe the guy said that. And he pulls up at a stop sign, and he said his front door just opened up because it was really windy, and it opened up. And he's reaching over to try to grab it, and he looks up at this house, and there's that same pastor sitting on the porch reading. So he goes up and he began to talk to him, and he said the pastor sat there with him for 2.5 hours. And Jeff said at that point, he gave up his idea of going up and going to Colorado, and turned around and began to rebuild his life spiritually. Eventually, he went up to the Muskoka region and established this Three Crosses Church. It's on a 32-acre parcel of land that overlooks the lakes. And what they did was they created kind of a spiritual pilgrimage. You can lease or rent little cabins there for your own. But they did an interactive thing where as you walk through the woods, you come across little areas that represent Jesus' spiritual mark, Jesus' life, etc. And I think he just retired. I got to know Jeff because for a while I was an adjunct professor at Tyndale Seminary up in Toronto. And Jeff was one of the students of getting a D-Min there. And actually it was interesting because while I was teaching the class on discernment and openness to God, he asked if he could sit down and talk with me, and that's where he shared the story. So again, the question is, what do we do with stories like this? What do we do with experiences like this? This, believe it or not, is not as uncommon with pastors as you might expect. A significant number of pastors have had spiritual experiences, including me, that eventually, mine was, and I don't know if I'm going to talk about this, I may talk about it in a future class, mine was working in a psych hospital and having a client we were going to be sending to a long-term facility, having a teen patient, and he had an hallucination where he saw Jesus in the window, and it gave him guidance on how to get better. And that kind of shook up my life, because at that point I had walked away from the church. I called myself spiritual but not religious, but I wanted to have nothing to do with the church. But that experience through my patient is eventually what led me to do the joint program between Pitt School of Social Work and Pittsburgh Seminary. I never had any intention of becoming a pastor. I was going there so that I could actually know how to deal with spiritual experiences, like kids seeing Jesus in the window to give them guidance on how to get better. What I found out is seminaries don't do a very good job of doing that. That's another issue. And again, the question is, what do we do with stories like this? Foundationally, and this is really what I'm kind of hitting today, when we move into the next time we gather, I'm going to talk more and more about spiritual experiences themselves. But the question is, and this goes back to exactly what you were saying before, are we receptive to spiritual experiences? Do we approach them with acceptance, with doubt, with denial, with rational explanations, theological explanations, scientific explanations, biological explanations? Do we ignore them? Do we dismiss them as mere anecdotes? I mean, I think this is something we need to ask of ourselves. What is my perspective on spiritual experiences? What is my perspective on whether they exist or whether they don't exist? How do churches deal with spiritual experiences? Do we ignore them without offending those who've had them? If somebody tells you about their Pentecost experience, how do we respond to that? What is our response to that? Again, do we ignore them, but try not to offend them? Do we push them away or cast doubt on those who've had them? I will tell you right now, significant number of people outside of church have had dramatic and influential spiritual experiences, and they will not come to a church because they're worried about how churches are going to see them. I have been involved in a group called the International Association of Near-Death Studies. I'm not heavily involved, I'm kind of on the fringe, but I am part of a clergy group that meets once a month that talks about spiritual issues. And 2 years ago, they have an annual conference, which they get about 600 or 700 people at the conference from all over the country and the world. But I did a panel with 3 other pastors called Spiritual and Religious. And we talked about how don't just give up on churches because they are places that nurture spirituality even if you don't think so. And all of us had a really interesting experience afterwards. We had a number of people come up to us individually and collectively who thanked us for giving the talk and then said, I really appreciate it. You know, I come here because I've had spiritual experiences and these are people who are open to my experiences. But I'm also involved in a church and I love my church, but I can't talk about my experiences in the church because they'll think I'm crazy. So I go to church so that I can worship God, and I come here so that I can share my experiences. Churches aren't necessarily safe places to share experience. By the way, 2 things for you all up here on this chair are 2 handouts for today. And I hope they'll probably be here. One is, this is actually an article that I wrote for the Presbyterian Outlook, which is on the topic of our class, but it also explores why people who have spiritual experiences don't feel the church is the right place. And if you're interested in actually digging deeper, this is a list of books that you can read that look at different kinds of spiritual experiences. So these are here for you, for yourselves on your own. So again, what do we do with the experiences in the church? Do we avoid the topic altogether by focusing on other religious topics? One area, for example, I've noticed, I don't know how aware, how do I say this? How often does Jesus heal in the Gospels? How often does he go out and heal people?
A lot.
A lot. How often do we preach on healings? In the mainline church, most pastors, if they do talk about it, they'll talk about it in a metaphorical way. They do the same thing with the feeding of the 4,000 and 5,000. Well, the real miracle was everybody just brought their lunch and shared it. If that was the miracle, the Gospels would have said that. But that's what we do. We try to come up with a rational explanation. When if you actually dig into what was going on biblically, you know that is not what happened. The purpose of the class is not to break down biblical passages. I will simply say these people did not go to see Jesus expecting to be there that long. But they were all part of caravans that were off a little ways, because the reason there were so many people there is because once a year people took pilgrimages to Jerusalem, where they made their sacrifices, and they would go in huge family caravans for safety. And these were people who left the caravans to go hear Jesus talk. They wouldn't have brought their lunch because they didn't, first of all, you didn't walk around with lunch. But second of all, they didn't expect to be there. But, we do this, when it comes to healings or other things, we often don't know what to do with them. And it does present something on Easter where pastors often feel like, I have to give a sermon that somehow proves that the resurrection really did happen. But we're not really sure how to do that. Other ways that we deal with it are, again, do we talk about spiritual experiences in sermons? Do we create safe places to share? At Calvin Church, we created a lot of small groups. We had a very large small group program that explored spirituality and spiritual experiences, including, for about 4 years, we had what we called the near-death experience group. And you didn't have to die to be a part of it, where we just explored accounts of people's near-death experiences. Or, we had prayer groups, or we had a science and spirituality group, which was exploring the connection between spirituality and science. Other things, do we create groups to explore them? Do we teach classes about them? I guess we don't teach a class about them right now. Do we offer personal testimonies? You can see this is some of the stuff that we did at Calvin Church, where we collected stories, we did classes on them, we created groups on them, and things like that. The spiritual problem in the mainline church, and I am being repetitive, but I'm trying to get an idea through that hopefully will stick beyond here. We tend to rationalize, theologize, or functionalize. I'll get into that a little bit later. Rather than accept experiences of connections to and relationships with God. Often what happens is we have a tendency to focus on, do you believe the right things? As opposed to, are you open to the right things? A great example of that, if you get a New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, and you read in chapter 14, where Jesus says, believe in God, believe also in me. That's a very Presbyterian translation of that. The Greek word is pistis. Anybody know what pistis means? It means trust. It means abandonment. It means surrender. What's happened for generations, though, is we've turned Christianity into a matter of believing the right things, as though God is sitting around, kind of going, gosh, I really hope Beth wakes up and believes that I exist today. I don't think that's what God's worried about at all. I think what God wants is a relationship with us. I think what God wants is a connection with us that's actually tangible and life-transforming. Belief is just, as Jesus said, even the devil believes in God. That really what it should be translated is, trust in me, trust in God, trust also in me. In other words, give yourselves over to me. That makes much more sense in the context of Jesus' sermon in the upper room than it does than believe in God, believe also in me. As I said, the Bible is full of spiritual experience. Jesus healing, Lazarus raising, changing water into wine, Peter walking on water, feeding of the 4,000, 5,000, Jesus' resurrection, multitude resurrection. There's a really interesting passage that, it's funny, I didn't pick it up until 2 years ago, where I read an article about this. But if you read Matthew 27, basically it says in verses 52 through 53, it says that at the moment Jesus was resurrected. I don't know how many of you heard this and actually, because I didn't, and I've read that passage, so many times, from seminary and beyond. But it basically says a multitude came up out of the ground and were walking around. Not like zombies, but like real people were resurrected along with Jesus. I don't know what we do with it, but just the fact that I never picked up on it basically meant I was trained not to. How many times? I guarantee you, I've used that passage for Easter, and I didn't pick up on it because we get trained not to pay attention to it. Pentecost, Paul's conversion, Paul's near-death experience, which he writes about, and I'll get into it another point. James called the elders to do healing prayers. Again, we use that word salvation. What does the word salvation mean? Yeah, save, rescue, right? So in James, I may do this later, another point. But real quickly, there's a passage where James says, "Are any among you sick? Call the elders to pray on them." And according to NRSV, the prayer of faith will save the sick and they will be lifted up. I want to ask you a question. If you come to me for healing prayer, are you hoping that my prayer will save you and get you into heaven? What are you hoping my prayer will do? Make you well. That word, soteria, in Greek, salvus in Latin, it does mean save. But if you have a wound on your arm, what do you put on it? Salve. Yeah. The Latin root is salvus. The word soteria in the Bible can mean to save, but it also more fundamentally means to heal. And when Jesus says, when they do this, doesn't it make more sense that the elders are going to come and the healing prayer, the prayer of faith will heal the sick and they will be lifted up. But again, because we've been trained to think a different way, we don't think of it that way. Let me do this. I'm going to start with that. Beth, do you think you can have like 4 extra minutes?
Well, if people have to leave, they can leave.
Okay,
Yeah, it's 10:51.
Yeah. Let me do this real quick, and then I'm going to end here because the next 3 times we're gathering, I'm not giving this background. I'm really moving into spiritual experiences. Let me tell you actually what I'm trying to do with this class. When I was trained as a spiritual director, what they said was, if you want to open people spiritually, you first have to look at the obstacles that are getting in the way of them opening spiritually. Then you have to move into what would facilitate spiritual growth. So this whole class, what I'm doing is I'm looking at obstacles. What gets in the way? How did we lose the emphasis on experience? The early church grew because of how Christians lived and the power of their prayer. If you go in and read about the early church, prayer, healing prayer, the expectation of spiritual experiences were very much a part of the Christian belief, the Christian communities, really for the first 3 centuries of Christianity. And they grew because they did pray for people and people experienced healing experiences. Not everybody, but they also, in the Roman culture, which is a very brutal kind of socially Darwinistic, only the fittest survive culture, Christians acted differently. They gave food to the poor. They helped the poor. They cared about people who were struggling. They lifted up people, and they prayed for healing. And they created these communities, often that were against the law, but they created these communities. Christianity grew exponentially for 3 centuries when it was illegal to be Christian. What happened was, after the foundation of Christianity as the religion of the empire, slowly it became more bureaucratic, structural, etc. And in the Dark Ages, basically because people were getting sick, people were suffering plagues, it slowly eroded faith and prayer and experience because of plagues, war, conquest, poverty, and growth of the imperial church. And in the medieval, Enlightenment, and modern areas, the progression through them further diminished the experience because of the rise of science and medicine. The dominance of reason and rationality the splitting of modernity, which meant a lot of different fields began to compete with each other over who was the truth. You had biology who said, no, we are the ones who really know what the nature of life is. You had people in chemistry, you had people in physics, you had people in different scientific endeavors. The medical field and all were saying, no, we are the ones who have the real truth. And you see this among scientists, where, you know, my field is the one that's really the most true. And finally, the rise of order over ardor. In other words, what matters is order, not passion. Presbyterians do everything decently in order. Theology over spirituality, and skepticism over faith. So I want you to kind of think about this stuff for yourself. And then next time, we're going to really dig into, just to kind of give you what different kinds of spiritual experiences, how to understand spiritual experiences, all of these kinds of things in a way of really trying to get a sense of what spiritual experiences are. Are there any questions or thoughts before we end?
I always thought that people don't, even religious people or believers, don't understand the spiritual experience because it may not have happened to them.
Yes.
So they don't know how
Exactly.
to take what happened to you,
Yeah.
and you can't explain it to them.
Right. Because it doesn't fit.
Because I know some ministers that have never had this experience that I had.
Yeah.
I didn't understand it, but I knew it happened,
Yeah.
and I didn't know why, and I still don't know why.
Right. Right.
And I don't question it,
Yeah.
but I've had a number of them.
Yeah.
And I think that people get in their own way, and you can't just say, okay, I believe it, I open up my heart to you, talk to me.
Yeah.
And it don't happen that way.
No, it doesn't.
It comes out of the blue.
Yeah, it does. And I think part of it is that God's agenda for our lives is different from ours.
His way, not ours.
And that's what's difficult, because some people have near-death experiences and some people just die. Why? Well, it may have a lot to do with what God's intention is about our lives. For somebody who's died, their life really is over. Their mission in life, or whatever it is in life, is over. For others, that experience where maybe, you know, they have an experience, a near-death experience, and come back, it may be because it's, now I have an opportunity to really fulfill some kind of mission in life. But that's a personal thing. Okay, go ahead. You were going to ask something. Yeah.
Oh, I could talk forever on this. Thank you for what you presented. This is the first time I've heard a Presbyterian pastor articulate the spiritual aspects of life. And I would say I've been a Christian my whole life. I've ignored it up until the last 4 years or so. And this is what I believe is missing from my life. It had been missing from my life.
Yeah.
And I just, when you were here years ago, when Alan was here, you know, to me, I believe what Joseph Campbell says, this is myth.
Yeah.
And why deal with it? I have important things to do. It didn't fit my worldview. And it was a worldview raised in Christianity, but based on secularism, because that's the world I was living in and dealing with.
Yeah, yeah. And I will even say, Joseph Campbell says that myth actually pulls back the veil to realms and understandings that you can't get to through rational means. But we still hear myth as something that's not true, whereas it can actually be true and true. Well, let's close with prayer, and then I'll look forward to really jumping into experiences next time. Gracious and holy God, thank you for bringing us together. And Lord, I pray that your blessings would be upon everybody here. Help us, Lord. We're not asking for experiences, but I think what we are asking for is an openness to how you work and are present in life. Be with us and bless us and guide us. And we ask this in Christ's name. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.